The Vikings. Famous for long ships, axes, and let's just say their bedtime battles were bloodier than their raids. Imagine Tinder, but every swipe right came with the risk of being carried off on a dragon-headed boat. Netflix would have rated their dating lives 18+ for violence. Before we dive into their scandalous sagas, smash that subscribe like a Viking axe through a monastery door, and tell me in the comments, are you watching this during a midnight raid binge or at breakfast like a true berserker? Let's get straight to it. Viking sexuality wasn't your candlelit dinner and polite poetry kind of romance. It was rough, brutal, and tangled with honor, humiliation, and conquest. In Norse sagas, a man's reputation rested not only on his battlefield skill, but also on his bedroom conquests. Losing a duel was bad. Being mocked for unmanly behavior and sex? Worse. They had no word for privacy. Imagine your bedroom life becoming the opening act at a mead hall feast. Think Twitter cancel culture, but instead of hashtags, it was skaldic poetry performed with a drum. Now, Viking masculinity was brutal. To call another man arg, meaning effeminate, cowardly, or submissive, was the deadliest insult. You could sue someone to court for it. If you didn't challenge it, you lost your status. Viking gossip was basically, he raids monasteries but can't raid the bed. Boom, reputation ruined. And women? Viking women had more sexual freedom than most medieval queens. Divorce was allowed. Affairs weren't always fatal, but betray a husband's honor? Then the axes came out. Literally. Forget Love Island, this was Blood Island. We even have accounts of ritualized sexual practices tied to fertility cults, sacred groves, animal skins, and mead-fueled rites that would make a modern OnlyFans scandal look tame. Priests and priestesses used sex to invoke gods like Freyja and Freyr. To them, it wasn't sin, it was divine collaboration. Imagine trying to explain that to a medieval Christian missionary. Speaking of missionaries, the churchmen who encountered Vikings were horrified. Chronicles are filled with lines like, they lie with beasts, or they shame their women in public. Of course, some of it was exaggerated propaganda, but not all. When your enemies write your sex life like it's Game of Thrones fan fiction, you know things got messy. The sagas also describe men abducting women during raids. To the Vikings, capturing brides was proof of dominance. To modern ears, it sounds like pure brutality. And that's the disturbing part. Power, humiliation, and sexual dominance were stitched into their worldview. But here's the kicker. While men bragged, women weren't silent. Sagas record wives publicly mocking husbands' virility. Imagine a mead hall where your wife roasts you harder than a Netflix comedy special. Brutal. And if a Viking died, the funeral sometimes involved sexual rites. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler in 10th century Russia, described a chieftain's burial. A slave girl volunteered or was forced to join him in death after being paraded, drinking, and sleeping with multiple men in ritual. Disturbing? Absolutely. But to them, it was an honor. Forget pyramid schemes, this was a die-with-your-boss plan. The Viking world mixed sex, violence, and honor into one messy saga. Their long ships carried not just warriors, but reputations, rumors, and scandals across Europe. And trust me, the monasteries they raided weren't the only things left trembling. So yes, the Vikings sailed seas of blood, gold, and gossip. But their bedrooms? Even stormier than their voyages. And in part 2, we'll see how Norse gods themselves weren't exactly role models, unless your idea of romance is shape-shifting into animals for questionable affairs. If you thought Viking humans were wild, wait until you hear about their gods. These weren't your polite, heart-playing angels. No, Norse deities had affairs with giants, transformed into animals, and staged scandals so juicy, even today's tabloids would blush.
Think Zeus, but with frostbite. Let's dive in. Norse mythology wasn't a children's bedtime story. It was HBO drama before HBO. Odin, Thor, Loki, each had their quirks. And trust me, Freud would have had a field day. Take Loki, the god of mischief. One time, he turned into a mare, yes, a female horse, to distract a giant stallion. Long story short, Loki ended up pregnant. 9 months later, he gave birth to Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse. Forget modern gender fluidity debates. Loki was way ahead of the curve, literally neighing through it. Imagine explaining to your kids, "Daddy's not home. He's at the stable giving birth to a horse." But Loki wasn't alone in outrageous scandals. Odin, king of gods, was a serial knowledge addict. He sacrificed an eye for wisdom, hung himself on a tree for runes, and, according to some sagas, seduced priestesses while disguised as a wanderer. That's right. Ancient Norse had their own version of Tinder catfishing. Swipe left on one-eyed old men with suspicious cloaks. Then there's Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and let's just say creative bedroom arrangements. She owned a necklace so beautiful, even gods and dwarves lost their minds. According to legend, she slept with 4 dwarves to obtain it. A divine barter system? Maybe. But gossip spread across Asgard faster than TikTok rumors. Forget OnlyFans subscriptions. Freya had the first luxury jewelry collab. And what about Thor? You'd think the thunder god was too busy smashing giants to worry about scandal. Wrong. In one myth, Thor lost his hammer Mjolnir. To get it back, he had to dress as a bride and marry a giant. Picture Marvel's Chris Hemsworth in full wedding gown, veil and all, except this bride carried a hammer under the bouquet. The wedding feast ended with Thor smashing skulls instead of cake, but the scandal lived on in skaldic poetry. The Vikings loved mockery, and their gods were not spared. Imagine your religion's holiest texts written like roast comedy specials. What made Norse mythology so spicy is how openly it mixed sex, violence, and humor. There was no polished PR. The gods behaved like drunk mead-hole warriors. They cheated, tricked, transformed, seduced, and fought, often in the same saga. And people told these stories not just to entertain, but to reflect society. If your gods were chaotic, maybe your chaotic society made sense. After all, these were people raiding monasteries by day and holding fertility rites by night. Their pantheon wasn't divine perfection, it was divine scandal. And just when you thought it couldn't get weirder, there's Loki again. This time fathering monstrous children with the giantess Angrboda, a giant wolf, Fenrir, a world serpent, Jormungandr, and Hel, queen of the underworld. Imagine introducing your kids at a family dinner. This is Wolfie, Serpy, and oh, she runs Hell. Forget family sitcoms, this was the original Addams Family Viking edition. So when Vikings raised horns and told sagas, they weren't embarrassed by these tales, they celebrated them. In fact, mocking gods was part of the fun. Their faith wasn't about worshiping perfection, it was about surviving chaos, laughing at scandal, and making sure the gossip flowed as freely as the mead. So yes, the Viking gods were wilder than their worshippers, and in part 3, we'll see how these myths bled into rituals, where sex, sacrifice, and symbolism mixed in ways that would make even Loki blush. If you thought Viking gods were scandalous, wait until you hear about their rituals, because the Vikings didn't just drink mead and swing axes. They also threw in sex, sacrifice, and enough drama to make Game of Thrones look like a Sunday school picnic. All right, let's cut straight to it. Viking rituals were not polite affairs with hymns and polite nods. No, they were full-blown spectacles where everyone, from the Jarl to the thrall, knew the script. And that script usually involved blood, ale, and a whole lot of scandal. Take the blot, for example. This was their sacrifice ritual. Animals were slaughtered, blood was sprinkled on statues, and sometimes, rumor has it, humans too. And here's the kicker. Fertility festivals often combined sacrifice with sex. Because what better way to guarantee good harvest than to drink ale, smear pig's blood on your face, and then hook up behind a longhouse? Imagine your local church raffle, but instead of bingo cards, it's naked rituals under torchlight. These weren't just whispered stories. Arab travelers like Ibn Fadlan described Viking funerals in chilling detail. The dead man's possessions, slaves, even concubines, all offered to him in death. And yes, that meant one unlucky woman chosen to join her master. She was paraded, offered drink after drink, and then ritually used by warriors before being killed. Dark? Absolutely. But for Vikings, this wasn't cruelty, it was cosmic order. Death and sex were two sides of the same coin. Netflix crime documentaries have nothing on Viking funerals. And it wasn't all funerals. Fertility rites and sacred groves had their own theatrics. Picture villagers dancing under the moon, masked men dressed as gods, and women offering themselves in symbolic unions. Historians debate how literal these were, but one thing is clear: gossip about them spread faster than TikTok scandals. The Norse also loved Satire, magic rituals, often sexual, often shameful for men, because practicing Satire was considered unmanly, yet Odin himself was accused of doing it. So warriors mocked their god for being a cross-dressing witch. Imagine writing a hymn about Jesus and half of it is roast comedy. The Vikings invented Twitter cancel culture 1,000 years early. And even feasting had scandal. Mead halls weren't just about food, they were about boasting contests where men insulted each other's sex lives in verse. Skaldic poetry was basically Viking battle rap, except half the bars were, "Your wife prefers another warrior." And the audience? They cheered, they laughed, they gossiped. Shame was public, and nothing was off limits. Forget Eminem rap battles. Vikings did it drunk, with pig fat dripping from their beards. But here's the twist. While we imagine Viking society as all male dominance, women had sharp power. A wife could divorce a husband by declaring it publicly, and fertility priestesses wielded influence in rituals that frightened even kings. So yes, behind every drunk Viking raider was a woman ready to torch his reputation like an old longship. Viking women were the original "don't mess with me" energy. So when we talk about their sexual practices, it wasn't just chaos, it was organized chaos. Religion, politics, pleasure, and gossip were all tangled. And the people weren't embarrassed, they were entertained. They turned scandal into tradition. So next time you picture Vikings raiding, remember, they also threw festivals where sex, blood, and gossip flowed like mead. And in Part 4, we'll uncover the most shocking taboos, the ones even Vikings whispered about. If you thought the Vikings were already extreme, brace yourself, because behind the feasts and rituals, they had taboos so twisted, even their drunk poets whispered them like guilty secrets. Think of it as Viking dark mode, less Netflix comedy, more late-night horror special. Let's rip the bandage off. One of the most taboo practices whispered in sagas was incest among noble families. Viking chieftains often married cousins to keep power in the clan, but sagas hint that some crossed further lines. The Ynglinga saga accuses certain rulers of sleeping with their sisters, and the scandal spread like wildfire through gossiping poets. Imagine royal family drama, but with less crown polishing and more Game of Thrones family trees. Another whispered scandal? Bestiality accusations. The laws of Iceland were very clear. Sex with animals was punishable by death, which means it happened often enough to write it into law. And here's the kicker. The punishment wasn't just execution. Both the person and the animal were killed. Because apparently, the goat had to pay too. Cancel culture, Viking edition, but with goats. Then came the horrors of slavery and sexual exploitation. Vikings raided monasteries not just for gold, but for women and boys. Thralls, slaves, had no protection. They could be forced into whatever their master wanted. Yet sagas describe cases where enslaved women gained power through manipulation, turning forced bonds into leverage. society whispered about them like medieval soap operas. Forget Downton Abbey, this was Downton Dungeon. And if incest, bestiality, and slavery weren't enough, there were the blood rituals. Rumors of warriors drinking menstrual blood as a fertility rite, shocking even by medieval standards. Scholars debate if it was myth or propaganda, but the accusation stuck, staining reputations for centuries. Viking smear campaigns were nastier than Twitter threads. Even Viking men weren't safe from scandal. To accuse a man of being the bottom in bed was to destroy his honor. In Viking insults, being passive meant unmanly. So feasts were full of sly verses implying warriors took it the wrong way. The audience laughed, reputations crumbled, and sometimes blood was spilled. Viking stand-up comedy was basically lethal roast battles. And then there were the gods, who didn't set a better example. Loki, accused of turning into a mare and birthing a horse. Odin, mocked for practicing shameful magic. Freya, accused of sleeping with every god in the pantheon. Imagine your holy scriptures, but written like a scandal sheet sold outside a tabloid press. The Vikings invented OnlyFans. But here's the thing. All these scandals, taboos, and rumors were part of Viking identity. Their society thrived on gossip, satire, and fearless confrontation of taboo. What horrifies us today, they turned into stories, songs, and warnings. So while Viking ships conquered seas, their scandals conquered imaginations. And in Part 5, we dive into the dirtiest secrets of all, the bedroom politics that could topple kings.
भाई perfect timing. अब आता है Part 5 of the most brutal sexual practices of the Norwegian Vikings 793 to 1066 और ये वाला पार्ट पूरा फोकस करेगा बेडरूम पॉलिटिक्स और रॉयल स्कैंडल्स पे, मतलब जो सीक्रेट्स लिटरली किंग्स को हिला देते थे. Viking bedrooms weren't just for passion, they were war zones with sheets. Behind closed doors, alliances were forged, betrayals brewed, and more reputations were destroyed than in a season of Love Island. Forget you complete me. This was you complete my conquest. Then there were the morning gifts. A groom was expected to give his bride land, silver, or slaves on the wedding night. Fail, and your masculinity was toast. Imagine showing up with flowers when the bar was literally real estate. Viking Valentine's Day was basically Zillow. But scandal brewed fast. If a husband couldn't perform, his wife had the right to publicly humiliate him and even divorce him. Some sagas describe women storming into public feasts, announcing their husband's failure in bed, the medieval equivalent of subtweeting. Viking Twitter existed, it was called the feast hall. And then came jealousy-fueled bloodshed. One saga tells of a woman who accused her husband of sleeping with thralls. She poisoned his mead, sparking a revenge cycle that killed half a village. For the Vikings, sexual honor was as sharp as a battle axe. Imagine desperate housewives but with swords.
Even kings weren't safe. Harold Fairhair supposedly had multiple wives across Norway, sparking feuds between rival queens. Their gossip became warfare, turning the royal bed into a political minefield. The Viking royal bedroom, more explosive than Buckingham Palace tabloids. And let's not forget queens accused of sorcery to seduce their kings. A wife who was too influential risked whispers of using spells or potions. One saga even suggests that Freydis Eriksidottir, the infamous explorer, manipulated men with both charm and cruelty. Her reputation was half legend, half horror story. Basically, Vikings feared the original femme fatale. At the bottom of the ladder, enslaved women faced no choice. They were gifts, spoils, bargaining chips, their bodies part of the economy. But sagas also hint at enslaved lovers turning into mistresses who wielded real power, sometimes overthrowing noble wives. Talk about scandal. Forget rags to riches, this was slave to scandal queen. And here's the irony. The very sagas that record Viking bravery also preserve their dirtiest gossip. Heroes slain in battle, queens shamed in the bedroom, kings mocked for impotence. Vikings didn't just fight with swords, they fought with words sharper than steel. So next time someone calls the Vikings fearless warriors, remind them, half their battles were fought under the sheets, And in part 6, we sail straight into the dirtiest myths of their gods, where no scandal was off limits.